New tonight, independent journalists Don Lemon and Georgia Fort have filed a joint motion to obtain the grand jury transcripts from the proceedings that led to their indictment on federal civil rights charges for covering that ICE protest, you guys remember that, at a St. Paul church service last month. This comes just hours after Lemon pleaded not guilty to those charges in court. MS now has learned that Lemon's phone was seized during his arrest and is still in DHS custody more than 2 weeks later. Here's Don Lemon just after his arraignment.
People are finally realizing what this administration is all about. The process is the punishment with them. And like all of you here in Minnesota, the great people of Minnesota, I will not be intimidated. I will not back down. I will fight these baseless charges, and I will not be silenced.
Joining us now, editor-at-large for the 19th, Erin Haynes. She's the current president of the National Association of Black Journalists and an MS Now political contributor. Former CIA Director John Brennan is back with us.
What disturbs me most about these proceedings, to be very clear, this is an escalation. The government arrested and detained 2 journalists 2 weeks ago. Those journalists were back in court today, and those charges were not dropped. In fact, this case is moving forward. This is an escalation, America, in case we were wondering. I want everybody to the stakes have been raised, okay? Are we in a constitutional crisis? I don't know. How many data points do you need? That being said, Erin, the thing that I am most, if I could rank my disturbances on this issue, what most disturbs me about this is that the Civil Rights Act, particularly the Civil Rights Act of 1960, is being weaponized against 2 journalists who also happen to be black, and I don't think that's an accident. The laws in this country, the civil rights laws that were fought for to inject some equity into this experiment that is the American democracy, are now being weaponized in a way in which I don't think in 1960, 1964, 1965, civil rights activists thought were possible.
Well, I think
maybe they did.
Yeah, I was going to say, Simone, I mean, I do think that Black journalists have often had to do the work that is part of the work of democracy. You do not have a truly representative, truly free press and not have a truly representative and free democracy. They're trying to do the work of democracy often under duress. We know that Black journalists did that during the civil rights movement. We know that there were Black journalists that did that during Jim Crow. And so you see that there are Black journalists, and frankly, Black journalists who disproportionately are covering things like protests, civil unrest, police violence. Maybe we'll be covering, elections that could be contentious in this country. Black journalists are covering those stories day in and day out with integrity. You see Don Lemon coming out of that hearing, maintaining that the First Amendment protects what he was doing. He was committing journalism, not committing a crime. We cannot say that enough. We cannot say enough that the First Amendment is not optional, right? And that all journalists, including Black journalists, must be able to do their jobs safely and without fear of criminalization for doing their jobs and not being accused of participating in a protest, which is clearly not what he or Georgia Fort were doing.
Director Brennan, to the stakes that both Erin and Simone laid out there, I was struck by this part of the Lemon Fort motion that says the charges they are facing may align with the behavior of authoritarian regimes all around the world. In the United States of America, we do not prosecute journalists for doing their job. That happens in Russia, China, Iran, and other authoritarian regimes. And yet the government sold this unconstitutional mess to the grand jury. Disclosure of the grand jury proceedings is necessary to ensure the government did not mislead or misinstruct it. You're our national security intel expert. If you saw this happening in another country, what would it indicate to you?
It's a dictatorial regime that's trying to suppress the freedom of the press, which is one of the institutional pillars of a free and democratic society. The video footage of Don Lemon at church belies the charges that are made against him. My goodness, if these actions are going to be taken against newspapers and journalists, media, the Fourth Estate, it really does threaten our democratic society and system. And, we see individual prosecutors who are going after these types of charges. And they have to remember that they do have ethical responsibilities, as I'm sure you and others know, that although, Donald Trump can pardon individuals for, these outlandish acts, disbarment is a real potential for some of these individuals, these lawyers, who are pursuing these frivolous charges despite the fact of a lack of evidence. So again, I think what Don Lemon is saying, the process is the punishment. Yes, what they're trying to do is to intimidate others and to try to make sure that other members of the press, the media, are going to be intimidated and not go out and do their work. As you point out, in the civil rights movement, it was so critically important that we had journalists on scene taking those videos and taking the camera work that was going to be able to reveal exactly what was going on and the oppressive nature of the government actions. So this is so critical, especially at this time now, as I've said, when there's such controversy and turbulence in our country. We need that media. We need the press. We need it to expose the overreach, the abuses, the malfeasance that's going on in many parts of our country.
And they don't want those things to happen. We're talking about the intimidation, the process being the point. There is some sound from Ed Martin, the pardon attorney who was just removed as the head of the DOJ's weaponization group. He has his own issues that he's dealing with. But he said something last May that I think is really important for this conversation and tells you everything you need to know about this administration and the kinds of folks they're going after and what their actual intent is. Let's just listen to this.
There are some really bad actors, some people that did some really bad things to the American people. And if they can be charged, we'll charge them. But if they can't be charged, we will name them. And we will name them. And in a culture that respects shame, they should be people that are shamed. And that's a fact. That's the way things work. And so that's how I believe the job operates.
Aaron Haynes, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time, right? Madam Maya Angelou said that. And I think it is really important for the American people to fully understand that at the end of the day, it doesn't appear that Donald Trump cares if these folks actually go to jail, if they actually broke the law, whether it's Don Lemon or whether it's Lisa Cook or whether it's anybody else that this administration has gone after. The process, making them spend money, making them get lawyers, in Donald Trump's eyes, hopefully getting a mugshot out of some of these folks, especially maybe Don Lemon and Georgia Ford, specifically, is part of the point. And I wonder, as president of NABJ and as a journalist who's been doing this for so long, how that changes the game for reporters trying to do their work and in turn changes the game for the American people.
Absolutely. I mean, look, this is certainly we are seeing Don Lemon and Georgia Ford in the headlines, but Don was exactly right to point out that this is not just about him, right? I mean, so many journalists that cover protests are freelancers, they're independent reporters, they're local journalists whose names we may, not necessarily be familiar with. And as household names, they don't have the visibility, they don't have the platform, they don't have the resources that maybe some better named journalists do. But the concern really is the precedent that this sets, right? Whether journalists broadly can safely document events without facing legal consequences, which we know, can be very expensive and frankly, can create a chilling effect. Certainly, I'm hearing from members who saw the arrests of Don Lemon and Georgia Ford and wondered, could I be next? What protections do I have under getting very familiar, frankly, with the First Amendment and what legal options they have and just reaffirming their right to commit journalism without being accused of committing a crime. So look, Simone said that today was an escalation. What happened today is important because Don Lemon and Georgia Ford have pleaded not guilty, and that means that this case is now going to move forward in the courts. But it does raise these larger issues that we have to keep talking about around press freedom. We saw that Don and Georgia were in their capacity as journalists at that church. They were documenting what was happening. Journalists have to be able to do that work, especially when it involves protest or government action, without fear of criminal prosecution. We cannot state that enough. And particularly the concern for independent journalists, right? Independent journalism is a growing and essential part of our media ecosystem. It's certainly a growing part of NABJ's membership. And so the First Amendment protects journalism itself, right? It doesn't matter where that person works, or whether they're at a major network or whether they're independent. What matters is the fact of reporting, and we have to keep saying that.